Hello and welcome back to the New Books Network. I'm your host, Dr. Raj Balkaran. Today I have the pleasure of inviting to the podcast Dr. Bernardo Kastrup, who's Executive Director of Essentia Foundation. He's also very highly and uniquely trained. He has a PhD in philosophy, ontology and philosophy of mind, and another PhD in computer engineering. I'm sure we'll hear more about that shortly. We will be focusing today on his brand new publication, Analytic Idealism in a Nutshell, a straightforward summary of the 21st century's only plausible metaphysics. Bernardo, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate the opportunity, Raj.
Yeah, the pleasure is all ours. You have to tell us a little bit about this journey of yours and your training, this unique and perhaps even a mysteriously complementary training of yours. Tell us about this academic journey, please.
Since I was very young, I was influenced by my father, who was very much into science, technology, did electronic projects, built and flew remote controlled airplanes. And he was always busy with something engineering related, although he was an architect by education. So I also grew up during the home computer revolution, in the late 70s and early 80s. It was my generation that was exposed to that when we were kids. So since I was very young, I wanted to design my own computer, not just put it together, but design from scratch my own bespoke computer. I ended up going to a computer engineering school. I was 17, spent 5 years there as usual. And then I went to CERN, the European Organization for Nuclear Research, where I was a team member in the very beginning of the LHC project. The LHC, the Large Hadron Collider, was approved in 1994. Well, at least the Atlas experiment was approved in 1994, and I was there in 96 and 97. And we had to develop these data acquisition systems to decide whether the data we were seeing was old physics or new physics. And then we had to store it if it were new physics. And we did it with our human understanding of physics, but in parallel, we also came up with an AI to do the same thing. And it was just as good as the physicist's understanding of the physics. Of course, it was not used because back in the 90s, people didn't quite understand how neural networks worked. We didn't have visualization tools. So although we could prove that it worked, physicists were very cautious because they didn't know how it did what it was doing. So we didn't use that, but the question remained in my mind. I can build a computer that is as smart as a physicist and faster than a physicist in evaluating experimental data. What does it take to make it conscious? And that sort of led me into the philosophical rabbit hole, because I realized after a few years thinking about it that whatever I could change or add or remove from my computer, I would have no more and no less reason to think that it has become conscious, because whatever I changed has a bearing only on structure and function and had nothing to do with sentience. And I realized that I hit a dead end, that I had taken a wrong turn along the way. I made some unexamined assumption that I took for granted, but I should have been critical about. So I backtracked and traced my steps back, and I realized the wrong assumption was that consciousness is something that is created out of particular material arrangements. I realized that that made absolutely no sense. It was a completely arbitrary postulate. And therefore, my physicalism was out of the window for me. I was a sort of unthinking physicalist up until that point. And I had to construct a new worldview for myself at first. And I was not thinking about writing a book. I was thinking about having a coherent narrative in terms of which to relate to the world, to relate to reality, because I was stepping on eggs the moment I realized physicalism was just false. Took me a few years. I wrote it down for myself, and eventually a publisher thought, this is interesting, we should publish this. And there began my philosophical journey. At some point, I got a PhD in philosophy as well. I already had one in computer engineering along the way. So therefore, this double-pronged background.
That's fascinating and serendipitous, perhaps. But this question about reality, this question about whether reality is comprised of physicality alone or something beyond that. This question of consciousness, it's at the heart of so many traditions. It's an ancient question. Of course, my particular training is in Sanskrit narrative texts. I study Indic thought, Indic philosophy, theology, mythology, etc., etc. But I'm very much interested in the modern debates on what exists and what doesn't. And because of this, I haven't really talked about this on the podcast, but I have this very nerdy interest in physics and modern physics, and I watch all of these YouTube channels, and I'm trying to figure out if the physicists are getting anywhere on the nature of reality or not. You say something really, really succinctly, and I think aptly in the very outset of the book about what is this book about? It's about the nature of reality. And this distinction, this characterization of science and the scientific method as descriptive of what is being done, what is happening, but not necessarily what is. And I think this is profound, and I can't help but think of ancient strands of Indic thought, particularly Sankhya philosophy, which thinks of the world as two co-eternal substrates: prakriti, that which is moving all the time, time space, and purusha, which is just being. So it's really fascinating to me. But enough of me putting ancient Indic words in your mouth. Let's hear more from you.
I'm very comfortable with that. Go ahead, no problem.
what what would you say is the primary objective goal transformation that you hope the book would accomplish?
I hope it will at least get us to think more clearly about our predicament, our situation. Our culture takes for granted a number of things that are flat out false. For instance, we think that science can tell us everything there is to be told about the nature of reality. It does no such thing, and that is its strength. Science is an empirical method. The way it works is it formulates hypotheses about what nature might do next, sets up an experiment to trigger nature's behavior, and then checks the result. And if we predicted it right, we have good science. In other words, science predicts the behavior of nature because that's all empirical experimentation can do. Nature answers to a question posed to it by an experiment by doing something in response. That doing is a behavior. Science doesn't tell you what things are in and of themselves. What is the essential nature of physical entities? It doesn't even tell us that the theoretical entities, such as elementary subatomic particles and fields, it doesn't even tell us whether those really exist because it is irrelevant for science. Most people don't understand this. Science only needs convenient fictions. In other words, nature behaves as if there were elementary subatomic particles and fields within a certain set of constraints. And at some point, we realize that our convenient fictions are not good enough. So we take new ones. Like Newton had this convenient fiction that gravity was an invisible force that acted at a distance. Well, with Einstein, we realized that that convenient fiction was not true. Although we put a man on the moon with it, it was not convenient when it came to the orbit of Mercury or gravitational lensing and other things. So now we have a new convenient fiction, which is the fabric of space-time bends and twists. Is this really true? Probably not, because now we are talking about loop quantum gravity, which reduces time. Time is no longer a thing with its own existence. It's reducible now. So that's what science does. It tells us what nature will do next based on convenient fictions. But we think science can tell us everything, and we think that physicalism is implied by science. Physicalism is a metaphysics, is a statement about things, what things are. Physicalism says things are fundamentally unconscious. Consciousness arises as an epiphenomenon or an emergent phenomenon of particular physical arrangements. And we think that that's the scientific view. It's not. It's a metaphysical view of a metaphysics that arose together with Western science. But one does not depend on the other. So I hope that the book will raise these issues at least, and at least lead to a debate, if not to a conclusion about what the true nature of reality might be.
That's utterly fascinating. I mentioned to you at the outset before we started recording that one of my students in my online school, where we look at the academic study of religion as well as, from a practicing perspective, we were doing some close exegesis on the Bhagavad Gita, and she commented that so many of the things that were being said in interpreting and expanding on the verses from yours truly were really simpatico with much of what she had heard from you and read from your books and heard on your podcast. And that's sort of what really put your work on my radar. So I find it utterly fascinating that you're coming towards the same what are intuitions for me are actually deductions for you. You actually have cogent arguments to work through. For example, I've been saying for years that science is a methodology, not an ideology, and people are relating to it as an ideology, as truth in a sense of wow. Now I can hold this to be true. And when the findings or the theories are challenged, even among very seasoned and accomplished professionals, it's as if someone's questioning one's religious beliefs. They'll get very sensitive about this, and um, perhaps you can say a bit more about that methodology versus ideology, as I put it, or however else you'd like to frame it.
Yeah, we as a culture, we have created an ideology loosely based on science, and it's called scientism. Scientism is a pejorative term in science. If you accuse another scientist of scientism, that's an offense. You're basically accusing the other person of falling short of the methodology and the rigor of science and running away with conclusions that are not substantiated by the method and the current results of science. So yes, you're correct. Science is a methodology. It's one form of acquiring knowledge about nature. It is not an ideology in the sense that it has some metaphysical presumptions about what things should be. That's not science. That is scientism, which is again a pejorative term in scholarly circles. This probably doesn't answer your question fully.
That's fine. The questions are always meant to be generative, and there's not a particular answer that I have in mind.
But remind me of the rest of your question, because
it was this idea that I think is this idea that is more of an observation or a lay intuition on my part, because my scholarship is elsewhere. But you actually study this and think about this the way that I think about Sanskrit texts, and this instinctive intuition on my part that society, particularly the masses, have fallen prey to the function of physicality, physicalism, materialism, as a means of ascertaining truth, comparable to what religions have been doing hitherto.
Science as a method cannot tell us much about what reality is, about what nature is. It can exclude certain possibilities because nature's behavior may be inconsistent with certain hypotheses about what nature is. So science maybe excludes certain things, but it certainly does not give us a positive answer about what nature is, because it methodologically cannot. And that is not a weakness. That's the strength of science. That's what allows science to remain rigorous as opposed to going down a path of pure speculation. There are three main identifiable roads towards knowledge. The Western world emphasizes two of these and completely neglects the third. The two that the Western world emphasizes, one is reasoning. You can logically reason your way about what reality might be or cannot be because it's inconsistent. The other is an empirical approach. If you want to know something about nature, look at nature. Even set up the conditions through an experiment. When you look at nature, don't just speculate about what nature might do. Look at it and see what it actually does. Like Galileo dropping the two balls from the top of the Tower of Pisa to prove that objects of vastly different weights, so long as they are heavy enough so we can count the resistance of the air, if you drop them, they fall at the same time. The heavier object doesn't fall first. The acceleration induced by gravity is a constant. So this is empiricism. That's the second avenue. So reasoning, empiricism. But there is a third, which is completely neglected in the West, which is introspective intuition. And why is it valid? Well, it's valid because we too are parts of nature. We arise out of nature and within nature, and we never disconnect from nature. We didn't parachute here from an alternative reality. We popped out of nature. And it's not even out. We remain within nature. We are things that nature is doing, or verbs better. We are events that nature is doing. And therefore, it's entirely valid to look into ourselves and to collect information through the roots that connect us to the rest of nature, to ask questions and pose potential answers for the questions of what nature is, since we are part of it. So introspective intuition is a entirely valid avenue to knowledge, perhaps even the royal avenue to knowledge, certainly the royal avenue to metaphysical insight, like Schopenhauer in the West articulated over 200 years ago. But in the West, we neglect it. In the West, we think we can achieve everything there is to be achieved through reasoning and empirical experimentation. But if you understand Schopenhauer, you see that it is precisely the most important thing that is left out if we don't look at introspection and intuition, which is the nature of what it is like to be a physical entity. We are physical entities, and there is something it is like to be us. It's our thoughts, our emotions, our inner life. If we ignore that, we think that nature is just a facade, that there is nothing behind that matter that constitutes the rest of nature, even though there is something behind the matter that constitutes me. That's my conscious inner life. Why can't we conclude the same thing for the rest of nature? Well, it's because we ignore intuition and introspection in the Western world, which in the East has never been the case. The East has always, if anything, emphasized intuition and introspection. And to sort of apologize for the West, the Eastern tradition is 1,000 years older, at least, arguably more. If you look at Mohenjo, how was the name of those ancient cities in the Indus Valley?
Even from an academic perspective, the Upanishads themselves are at least at the 8th to 5th century BCE, not even going to the Indus Valley civilization. So 2,500 years of this powerful
And the
introspective
Vedas,
thought.
even much older.
The Vedic corpus, probably about 3,500 years ago. And yeah, there's debate
Perhaps
about the
more.
Indus Valley civilization. Yes, exactly. Yes, please continue.
So we are catching up, but the East has had a very large head start. So I'm sort of playing apologetics for the Western tradition, but it gives me personally tremendous reassurance when people tell me that what I'm saying is consistent, not only with the Vedic corpus, but all the interpretations that one can find in the Upanishads, because it's like a very much older and more mature cousin telling me you're on the right path. That's how I feel.
Yeah, that's utterly fascinating, and so part of this, I think, the strength in the methodology adopted in when teaching at the Indian Wisdom School or the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies, what have you, is being cognizant of the academic study of religion. So the study of religion through the lens of Western academia, and as you say, the emphasis on empiricism and the scientific method. Also, in my view, I think what really enriches scholarship on the humanities is space for the human being and human experience, right? And so I can do that responsibly as academic, but where the insights are next level and the connections are next level is when I rely on a very powerful intuitive experience that was wrought by thousands of hours of practice, of introspective practice and study and corroboration of study. And, the idea that you are simply made up of, everything you've eaten to this point, and your genes, etc. What is the process whereby you can witness the changes in yourself over the years? What is so there are all these thought experiments that we see in ancient Vedic or Upanishadic traditions that call us to introspection. And when one studies with a teacher and receives an initiation into certain practices, it becomes abundantly clear that there's much more behind the curtain than there is in front of the curtain of material world. And what you said at the outset, see this being more of an academic context, what I said is it's interesting. I've had these insights and intuitions, but I defer to you because you've done the rigorous academic work in this field. And then you turn around and say, hey, academics need to pay attention to this other area. Now, of course, especially in the realm of religion, we run the risk of superstition or dogma or perception or bias But by the same token, there's no question that there are rich experiences to be had in inner life, and that Indic traditions, whether Buddhism, Sikhism, Jainism, Hinduism, for lack of a better word, have been adept at mapping these experiences and modes and means practices towards these experiences for literally millennia. That we can say that even from a scholarly perspective. And so I find it utterly fascinating. I think part of our legacy in the West, we have a rich and glorious culture, but with all cultures, we have biases and we have pitfalls, we have blind spots, and that's just the way it is. But really good. Never before have Homo sapiens been so good at understanding material creation. But because we understand material creation so well and we stare at it so closely, we're blinded to what might be beyond the material. And I think part of our legacy is the particular trajectory of religion and science in the West. That schism doesn't quite happen in Indic thought. And also, we have a particular Abrahamic legacy of a worldview where nature, humanity, the divine, they're sort of separated out. Whereas in other spiritual religious traditions, that separation doesn't exist, and the understanding is that we are part and parcel of creation, and even divinity, etc. So yes, it's really refreshing to speak to someone arriving at similar conclusions and insights from such a different training and perspective and methodology. What is analytic idealism?
It's a notion that reality is, insofar as its essence, insofar as what it is for itself, in and of itself, reality is fundamentally mental or experiential in nature. In other words, it's experience stuff, it's consciousness stuff, subjectivity. That does not mean that reality is in my mind alone or in your mind alone, let alone in my head or your head. That's definitely not what idealism says. Analytic idealism says that there is an external world that we all inhabit. And that's why, if you were here, you would describe my study in a way consistent with my own experience of it. We inhabit a broader context. There is an external world. But that external world, just like our inner lives, is constituted of experiential states. And those experiential states present themselves to observation as we call matter. In other words, matter is what experience or mental processes look like when observed from the outside or from a third or second person perspective. An experience as we know it is the experience of that thing from a first person perspective. It's the same thing. My thoughts present themselves to me from a first person perspective as thoughts. But if there were a neuroscientist taking measurements of the very physical activity of my brain, my thoughts would appear to the neuroscientist as matter, dynamic, active, physical stuff, brain activity. So under idealism, brain activity is what inner experience looks like when observed from the outside. And therefore, the two things are correlated. The image of a phenomenon correlates with the phenomenon it is an image of. But brain activity doesn't generate matter. It is the imprint of matter upon observation. And that's the idea. Now, of course, this whole thing is based on there being inside and outside, because I'm talking about an external world beyond my mind. So what creates this boundary between inside and outside? Well, it's a very well-known phenomenon in psychiatry called dissociation. So if nature is one mind, one field of subjectivity, segments of that field dissociate, just like the mind of a human being with multiple personality disorder dissociates, or just like the mind of a healthy human being dissociates during a dream. During a dream, you think you are your dream avatar, not the rest of the dream, not the cars, the other people, the buildings. You are dissociated during the dream. When you wake up, the dissociation ends and your dream avatar dies. It's toast. But you don't start crying for the loss of your dream avatar because you realize it was a dissociation. It was you all along. Same under analytic idealism, the same applies to life. Biology or metabolism is what the dream avatar, a dream avatar of the mind of nature looks like when observed from across a dissociative boundary. Life is what a dissociation looks like. And death is then the end of the dissociation and therefore the waking up. And when you realize that you were not just the avatar, you were doing the whole thing. You just forgot about it during the experience because you were dissociated. So it's a very naturalist and realist approach to reality. It grants that there is an external world that would still be there if there were nobody here looking at it. It would still be constituted by experiential states. And that external world does not depend on our fantasies and wishes directly. It does what it does because it is what it is, regardless of what we think about it. But it gives preeminence to experience as the fundamental ontological category, and matter as just an extrinsic appearance of experience, not a thing unto itself.
What you say is, in certain circles, so evident, and in others, so contentious. Yet, to my mind, to my experience, yes, experience is irreducible. And of course, the experiences that occur in this complex known as Raj have manifestations that are physical, that can be measured, heart rate, brain activity, etc., etc. But it's evident, the more that I grow personally and spiritually, it's palpable that the experiencer is not tied to this material vessel. It's palpable, it's evident, and yet to say it to, I think in many circles, I would say, whether within religious studies, whether within various other sciences, I mean, you can tell me, I imagine it would be somewhat of an intriguing notion, to say the least. So say a bit about that, and maybe roll in this idea of, why is this the only plausible metaphysics for the 21st century?
Because everything else is internally contradictory, empirically unsubstantiated, explanatorily neutral. In other words, it explains nothing, based purely on psychosocial dynamics. In other words, culture level neurosis, sometimes even psychosis at the level of a culture. For instance, in the 1960s, we suffered culturally from this psychosis called behaviorism, which is the statement that people made with a serious face, that mind was just behavior. Not that mind was the cause of behavior, but that there was nothing to mind but behavior. So if somebody sticks a needle in your arm and you scream, then there is nothing to that but your scream. There is no real pain. It's just the scream. It's just the behavior. After that, spin out popped out, called eliminativism, which is also based on this notion that mind or consciousness doesn't really exist. It's a form of illusion, which then led to illusionism, which is, of course, internally contradictory immediately. What is it that's having the illusion, if not mind? Illusions only exist in mind. By saying that something is an illusion, you're precisely denying the existence of it anywhere else outside mind, but affirming its existence in mind. That's why it's an illusion. But people say in illusionism that mind itself, consciousness itself, is an illusion, which raises the question, what is it that's having that conscious illusion? So these are culture level psychoses. These are almost mental pathologies, in the sense that they absolutely fly in the face of reason. Even the ground level of reason is denied by this, and it's flat out ridiculous and preposterous. And yet our taxpayer money is being used to pay for a whole lot of academic, a lot less now. Illusionism and eliminativism are becoming the subject of jokes now, as they should, but there are still people who are getting tenure and salaries paid by our taxes, defending this kind of absurd, risible notions with a straight face. So how does this happen? There are psychosocial reasons for how things developed this way. It's a matter of psychology. It's not a matter of reason or an objective approach to things. It's about people's mental commitments to certain views. It's about ego defense, a tremendous impetus to avoid losing face. It's about finding meaning through fluid compensation. Like you find meaning if you can convince yourself that you are better than everybody else because you see some profoundly counterintuitive truth that everybody else denies because they are all, wish fulfilling idiots. If you start believing this, it gives you a great psychological impetus to defend bullshit, which is what's happening. So this began in the West um, in an innocent way. In the early days of science, back in the 17th century, um, even late 16th century, um, if you do science, you could be burned at the stake, like Bruno was in 1600 in a major square in Rome. So that was a wake-up call to scientists that they shouldn't impinge into the domain of the church. But what is the domain of the church? Well, it's the psyche, the Greek word psyche, which translates into mind, but also soul and spirit. So early scientists invented this domain outside psyche, outside mind, which they called physis or physicality taken ontologically. Um, and the founders of the Enlightenment were aware of it. Denis Diderot is on record saying physicalism doesn't work, but we have to use it as a weapon against the church. But around the middle of the 19th century, in the early days of the Industrial Revolution, and the bourgeoisie sort of taking a lot of power, the game was not to survive the clergy, but to supplant the clergy in temporal power and cultural influence. So now, instead of saying there is mind and there is matter, now we say, no, there is only matter. And mind, we don't know how, but it's just an epiphenomenon of matter. And people proceeded to actually believe it. And there was a big psychological payoff, which is you got rid of the greatest fear of humankind throughout history, which is the fear of what we will experience after death. That's the fear that the church controlled for 1,000 years to have complete domain over all the peoples in the continent of Europe. That fear in the middle of the 19th century was off the table. I mean, there is no greater payoff, right? You don't need now to think that you'll be held accountable for what you do after you die because there will be nobody there to be afraid or to suffer. When you're dead, you're dead. Today, we completely lost the sense of how reassuring this is because we take it for granted. And you see these psychological dynamics of culture level neurosis and psychosis still playing out to this day. The echo is reverberating. Has it been long? No, 4 centuries. It's nothing. No, the Hindu tradition, well, even before the Hindu tradition, the Indus Valley tradition has been around for at least 3,500 years. What is 400 years? It's nothing. But because we are immersed in it and we have such short mayfly-like lives, we think this is it. We don't live long enough to discern the ebb and flow of cultural history as it's playing out, the ebb and flow of cultural neurosis, cultural psychosis, and now and then a little bit of cultural reason. We just don't see it happening, but it is happening right under our noses right now.
So, analytic idealism, as you propose, what ramifications or does it have, if any, for religion, for spirituality?
I take religions very seriously in the sense that I respect it. As anything humans do, it has a dark side and can be misused with vastly deplorable consequences, and history records this. But if we are going to disregard and discard something we do because it has had bad effects in the past, then get ready to discard everything, absolutely everything. So, okay, that's not an option. I take religion seriously because I think it speaks to people in a manner that reaches deeper than conceptual reasoning. Because conceptual reasoning is a game played up here, up in your head, and it consists of knowledge by reference. If you believe a certain theory, a certain conceptual narrative, then you believe in what that narrative is pointing to. But there is another form of knowledge, which is knowledge by acquaintance. You believe something because you've been there, you've experienced it. So you can have a theory that tells you nature is one endless subject, one only mind. And you may believe it because there is a very, very good substantiation for it, which analytic idealism is an example of. But you may believe it because you've been that one mind. You have reached a state of consciousness that has brought you there. That's knowledge by acquaintance. And what religion helps people do is to find a path towards knowledge by acquaintance. Instead of getting stuck in conceptual reasoning up your head, which is not transformative. It doesn't change your life. It doesn't change the way you feel. But acquaintance with something that is transcendent, guided by the indications that religion provides, the ritualistic indications, the symbolic indications, that does transform one's life. That is not something one can deny. It's not subject to argument and spreadsheets of pros and cons. Once you've been there and you've seen it, you cannot unsee it. So I think religion is helpful in that way. But what we need in the West, and now the West has sort of spread its influence around the world, has contaminated everything. But what we need in the West, and therefore in the whole world, is intellectual permission to take religion seriously. For as long as you think that religion is to be taken literally as a sort of a collection of implausible tales, okay, it's never going to sink in. You're never going to be acquainted with that which religion is pointing at. You will shut it out because the intellect is the bouncer of the heart. So I think, and I hope, what analytic idealism may do in this sense, it's not what I created analytic idealism for, but if it can have this side effect, then this side effect is the most important thing analytic idealism could ever do, which is to help people give themselves intellectual permission to take religious mythology seriously.
I cannot begin to convey how resonant what you're saying is to so much of the work that I do. My primary expertise is in Sanskrit narrative traditions, mythological texts. And I find myself continually trying to convey to folks, whether in academic or experiential settings, that the historical or literal veracity of the text is the wrong question. They're spiritually true. They're not historically true necessarily. They're not even, and so when I use narrative to teach, not just sometimes as a subject of the teaching about them, but teaching through them, whether it's in a comparative religion, maybe undergraduate class, or I say, look, we're going to adopt the hermeneutic of suspicion, and we're going to think through this, and we're going to think through the sociocultural crud of tradition and all of the biases and all of the motivations. But then let's adopt the hermeneutic of let's be sympathetic to the experiential. What might this do for someone? Whether or not Jesus of Nazareth walked the earth and walked on water, what does this have to do about the levity of being, countering the gravity of our primate nature? This is extraordinarily powerful and exalting to the consciousness if you allow it. And yet, oh, that's nonsense. And then you'll go and you'll watch Daenerys, Mother of Dragons, unburnt by fire. You have a religious experience in the theater. You watch Luke destroy the Death Star, and you have a religious experience because it's safe. Because it's a safe space where it's not intellectually true. You just use this brilliant phrase that the bouncer of the heart, the intellect, can relax and say, okay, receive this as story, as powerful story. So sci-fi fantasy is safe for these exalted mythological ideas. But we've thrown the baby out with the bathwater because we're so smart. We can see through Brahmanism or the church or this or that. But we fail to be moved by the utter power of these teachings.
There is a reason for that, I think. I've thought very long about this because, like you, I'm very curious about how this can be. And several people have asked me over the years, so do you think Jesus really existed? And I usually answer, I don't give a damn. It's utterly unimportant whether there was really a man called Yeshua running around in the deserts of the Levante. I mean, Jesus exists archetypically or archetypally, and that's the only thing that matters. In the West, people relate to archetypes, the archetypes of nature, meaning if nature is one mind, one field of subjectivity, then it has preferential templates of behavior, just like humans have. Humans have many archetypes, the archetypes of the mother. If you have a baby or you're caring for a young animal, uh, the mother archetype kicks in and you know how to behave that way instinctively. There's the archetype of the hero, which is what, for instance, our business executives try to embody, which is there's a great challenge and you go in that great adventure to overcome difficulties. That's the archetype of the hero. So in the same way, the human mind has these templates and this intrinsic templates of behavior. If the universe is one mind, so does the universe have archetypes. The problem is that the Western mind has a very strong tendency to relate to the archetypes only via the intermediation of particular embodiments of the archetype. In other words, we are interested let's take history. It's a very good example of this distinction. In the West, we want to know the details of history. We want to know the names of the kings, where the battles took place and who was involved, in which year, who won and who lost that one specific battle. What were the names of the wives of Henry VIII? Why did he kill Anne Boleyn? When did that happen? What were their names? So we relate to this um, intrinsic archetypes through particular embodiments of the archetype. We relate to the archetype of the mother through the embodiment in our mother, our grandmother, the mother of a friend, or the woman who took care of us when we hurt our feet as a kid playing in the neighborhood. We need this embodiment to relate to the archetype. The Indian mind doesn't, never did. The Indian mind goes straight to the archetype. And that's why Indians historically didn't record history. Indians don't give a damn which king, when there is one king in the mythology. That is the archetypal king. That's the only one that truly exists. And it's the only thing that matters. So why are we going to record when the battles happen? What was the name of the king and how many daughters and sons? The Indian mind doesn't give a damn. The Indian mind goes straight to the thing, to the archetype. The Western mind, because of this literalist prejudice, can't do that. The Western mind needs the intermediation of specific characters and events, embodiments of the archetypes. And that's why for the Western mind, we need to know if Joshua really walked the sands of the Levante. While for the Indian mind, whether Krishna really was a blue being incarnated running around and giving advice in the midst of battle, it it's utterly irrelevant. It does not matter. That's the difference. And it's a difference that we in the West have one to become aware of and then learn how to manage it.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating what you say, and in terms of obviously there's going to be debate distinctions about East and West and Indic and Western and all that, and then we have this phenomenon of highly Western trained individuals who happen to be of Indic origin, who are very critical of spiritual or philosophical traditions, and then many of my students are genetically or demographically Western, but they're very much interested in Indic thought. And I came up with this way that I teach it. I call it tongue in cheek, obviously, the particle wave theory. That consciousness is like light. We have an impulse towards a particular. Perhaps we can map onto the left brain loosely, and then an impulse towards the wave, the universal, the personal and the transpersonal. The discrete, the minutia, the details, the scholarly impulse, and then the more experiential impulse or transpersonal impulse. And I think we're constantly navigating between the two. And I think some of us are congenitally more geared towards one than the other. And yet I think that the height of human achievement and the height of human consciousness is when you can do both and you can toggle between the two. But I think without question, there is, for a variety of historical reasons, a trajectory towards prioritizing the analytic. I mean, I'll speak in code. There's literature that there are very significant differences between right and left hemisphere, and there's literature that problematizes that. So I'll use it more allegorically than scientifically, rather than have people quibble with me. But without question, Western civilization is skewed very far towards quote unquote the left brain, and the particular and the linguistic and the intellectual, which is great, except it's done at the expense of the other, perhaps more primal, perhaps more fulfilling mode of engaging reality that involves more introspection. And I do think that throughout the history of at least the production of Indic scriptures, for example, the Puranas. I mean, that's probably mostly what I study, these mythological texts circa 3rd century CE onwards. And they're called, Purana means ancient. They're saying this is ancient. Yet they're the relatively new class of text, but they're saying this is ancient wisdom, they're saying. And yes, I mean, for certain scholars, it's like pulling your hair out because they don't do authorship and they don't do dates. So trying to piece together the sociocultural scaffolding of why these texts were created can be quite challenging. And yet, as useful and important as that is, that enterprise elides what the Puranas themselves are trying to do, which is tap into eternal wisdom and reconfigure them for this circumstance. That these tales can be told and retold and adapted and readapted with one foot in the eternal and another foot in the particular audience at hand. And this is something that I think a great many scholars of Indic thought, however bright and insightful and however valuable their productions, fail to recognize the purpose of the text. We can think of it as a purpose in a practical sense, or what is the text responding to? For example, the text that I did my PhD work on is a great goddess text. It's the first great goddess text in all of Indic thought, about 5th century CE ish. There's debate about that, and it's the only surviving great goddess text from antiquity, only surviving great goddess tradition. This text comes out of nowhere. We'll probably never understand why the Brahmins, in all their wisdom, decided to compose a text after 2,000 years of Sanskrit composition. All of a sudden, yay, we need a great goddess. We need a mommy. No, well, clearly something was happening on the ground for a long time, and they decided to fold in that tradition into Brahmanism. And so those questions are important. But all the more important to my mind and my heart are, what would our experience be having a great mother at the helm versus a great father? How would we relate to the universe, to ourselves, to children, to nurturance? And this idea of the archetypal, I mean, one of the hymns in the text invokes the goddess as abiding in all beings in the form of motherhood. All beings. Sanskrit's very careful about gender. There's masculine, there's feminine, there's neuter. In all beings in the form of motherhood. This to me is exactly what you're saying about the archetypal, that motherhood can exist in people who are male, female, or neither, because it's not tied to their physiology.
Of course, these are instinctive templates of mentation, and each one of us inherits a certain mixture of all of these, eternal templates, so to say, because we are what we are, so we embody them. It's part of our nature. And you surely, I mean, in Jungian psychology in the West, the goal was a process that Jung called individuation. And it was not to elevate the ego, much to the contrary. It was part of putting the ego in its place as part of a sort of a mandala of influences and dynamics. And the individuation process, the goal of it is to achieve a balance in all the archetypal manifestations, all the archetypal dispositions that we embody. So it's important for a man to bring in, to reconcile himself with his own shadow side. And his shadow side might contain the archetype of the mother, or the archetype of the female, not in a sexual or gender-oriented sense, but in the sense of how you feel within. Do you feel soft and caring and nurturing towards other beings around you? If so, you can embody the archetype of the female without ceasing to have the gender and the sexual orientation you have. So Jung was very mature in this regard, that he thought all archetypes should be harmonized in the process of individuation, which you can call it maturity. The process of growing up and becoming an adult entails sort of embodying a healthy archetypal mixture in proper balance. Otherwise, our behavior becomes pathological.
Speaking of Jungian thought, you have a chapter dedicated to this concept of his called circumambulation, which you call circumambulation. Tell us more about this.
We, since the Enlightenment in the West, we have this illusion about how we build knowledge. We think that we take one linear step at a time in a certain direction until we reach the goal. And at that point, we will know what we want to know. So it's a sort of a linear path that builds up one step of a time at a time in a certain direction. Any study of the history of science tells us that that is not at all how things happen. It's much more messy than that. We discard old ideas or only go on a tangent and we come back and review what we did before. It's more like Brownian movement than a linear walk in a consistent direction with small deviations. Jung internalized this problem. In the history of science, the problem is externalized at a cultural level. Jung internalized it, and the question he asked was, how do we attain greater insight and wisdom? How do we do that in our inner lives? Forget our external work. How do we mature and grow as human beings and acquire wisdom? And he realized that the only way to do this that had any reliability and any depth was circumambulation. And what that means is, instead of taking linear steps from a point of origin to a point of destination, maintaining a consistent direction, what you have to do is place the mystery that you're curious about in the center and then walk round about it. So you contemplate that mystery from multiple different perspectives. And each one of those perspectives may lead to a conclusion. And then you walk around about it a little more and you see it from a different angle. That leads to another conclusion, which may be contradictory with the previous one. And then you synthesize them. You try to bring your wisdom to a higher level of abstraction where things can be accommodated, a higher dimensional space, so to say. And you keep on walking round about it. And at the end, what you realize is that you are not walking in circles, you are growing on a spiral. But if you look at this spiral from the top, it looks like you're walking in circles. But in fact, you're going higher each turn of the spiral. So that's the way to acquire knowledge for Jung, circumambulation. And if you look at even the external history of science and culture, this is what we have done too at a cultural level. We also circumambulate. It's a delusion to think that we can take a straight shot towards the goal.
Yeah, I mean, the other way that I teach some of the differences between these two modes that I talk about, mode one and mode two, or left brain, right brain, or perhaps the modes that are most at the helm of quote unquote Western or Indic thought, is through the very cosmology, the very idea of a linear creation with a finite beginning and a finite end, and some 6,000 years through it, and the apocalypse is nigh. We'll soon reach the end, and say, dude, that's it. And then versus this idea that actually no, it's tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of years at very least, and that they'll just cycle. We're in the middle of one cycle. At the end of this, it's all dissolved and then recreated, and this idea of multiple cyclical creations. It's a compelling idea that this is what I think is much more of a right brain way of looking at the world. It's cycles, it's circles and cycles, and it fascinates me that everything within material creation is cyclical, from cells to galaxies to seasons, and yet we are so intent on this linear this linear mode of thought, which is extraordinarily useful, but also limited. and also
Extremely.
not to be not to necessarily be privileged in all paradigms. Now, I imagine that despite how accessible and to my mind well thought out your work is, one imagines that work such as yours, I know from my own work in certain circles, might create ripples for other colleagues or publics. And could you say a bit about reception? Because I really would like to get a sense of your perspective of where are we going? I mean, there are all these ideas on the market, and clearly, to my mind, certain ideas have passed their expiration date, and some people have perhaps many consumers on the global stage might be realizing this, and yet we need other sort of intellectual and spiritual nourishment. So, could you talk a bit about the reception of these ideas in your experience, and perhaps even the zeitgeist, if you'd be so
Yeah.
bold?
The zeitgeist has changed a lot in the past 15 years. I started talking about it in public 15 years ago, even though I had been thinking about this for much longer. Um, 15 years ago, anybody who would publicly say physicalism is untrue and we have to adopt a sort of a consciousness first ontology, anybody saying that was immediately dismissed as some wishful thinker or some religious fanatic or some
New Age
woo
flake.
new age flake. So even the discussion was not legitimized. This is no longer the case. In analytic philosophy in academia, the mainstream now is that we need to find an alternative to physicalism. Even though a lot of the scholars involved, they want to do that by extending physicalism and preserving some of its foundations, or completely changing it but preserving the name, which is a sort of making it unfalsifiable merely linguistically. Whatever the truth is, we'll call it physicalism. Then physicalism is true by linguistic definition. This is happening too. But what I mean is the debate is now legitimized. I am no longer accused of being a New Age flake, which I have never been, by the way. I even have a prejudice against New Age, but which I at least recognize. But today, that association is not done. Today, Bernardo Kastrup has polemical views, but he is not an idiot. He is not just bullshitting. There is depth to what he's saying. We may not agree with it. We may think he's wrong, but let's discuss this. One may even say, I'm absolutely sure that you're wrong, but one will come on the stage with me to say that to my face, as opposed to saying, no, 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 I don't want to rub off on New Age flakes. So this has changed. The zeitgeist is changing palpably in a short time. 15 years is nothing given the ebb and flow of cultural history. So it's good news that is changing. On the other hand, it has always done so. It's just that it's changing now in a direction that people like you and me recognize as more in line with eternal truths. But it was part of the archetypes of the great mind of nature to turn over every rock, turn over every stone, and see what is underneath. So the cultural psychosis of behaviorism, logical positivism, eliminativism, and illusionism, as psychotic and completely pathological as these things are, these were rocks that the mind of nature needed to turn over and look under. Otherwise, it would, the itch would still be there, an unscratched itch, right? So the mind of nature looks under every rock. That still is archetypal. But thank goodness we seem to be coming out of that dark age right now. We looked under that rock. We know what is in there. Now we can get on with the business of aligning ourselves and resonating more with eternal truths, with the facts of the matter, as opposed to our delusions.
Yeah, it's fascinating in that certainly, particularly ironically, maybe even paradoxically, the stigma between woo-woo and rigor is exasperated in religious studies because religious studies needs to demarcate itself from both theology, which is more looking, taking, accepting the presumptions of a faith tradition and trying to make sense of it, and also disambiguate from folks who have views entirely unfounded in reality. And so it's a fine line where one is attempting to look at and study responsibly a phenomenon of religion, whether historical, sociological, psychological, etc., etc. And then one has a rich experiential and inner life, because there's much more space now for scholar practitioners, and there's much more of an understanding that one having profound um, or depth of experience, spiritual experience, irrespective of your view as to whether or not that's possible, does not necessarily take away from their analytical ability to produce scholarship. So I think there is more space, as you say, for the discussion, even in my own niche. And I think the world is changing. And I think what I mean by the world is changing is that, look, as we well know, there have been ancient traditions on this earth for a very long time that have been preserved precisely because they pertain to the depths of our being. Why else would they be preserved? There's no shortage of creativity in the human experience, and there's no shortage of short attention spans of the human experience. And the tried, tested, and true models and texts and traditions about what it means to be human and how we can ameliorate our inner life, they've been preserved. The difference, I think, is now, for the first time, Homo sapiens have a burgeoning global consciousness. It may take a couple hundred years to really fully solidify, but we've never before known what people have been doing all over the earth, at the same time. And this is new for us. And as you say, this global experience has the indelible hue of Western trajectory, Western thought, Western civilization, which is wonderful at certain things and not so wonderful at other things, like any tradition or perspective. And I think that our very young civilization, which is about 16 to 20 years old, it knows everything. At that age, it knows everything. It doesn't listen to anyone older. And it's even about 25. For sure, by 30, oh, my parents are not that stupid after all. Like that.
There is a reason for that, a strong psychological reason for that. It's called fluid compensation in psychology, because once the West abandoned transcendence and decreed that it doesn't exist, that was in the middle of the 19th century, and it was enshrined as unquestionable dogma with the logical positivism in the early 20th century. We got rid of transcendence. The problem is that human beings are meaning-seeking animals. We feed on meaning. And when we discarded transcendence, we lost the source of meaning that is coupled to transcendent meaning. The meaning of our lives beyond our deaths, the meaning of life beyond the visible world. We discarded that. And human beings cannot tolerate that vacuum, so they have to fluidly compensate to another source of meaning. And the strongest one, psychologically, in the Western culture, is closure, which is the reason that, say, your son got killed in the military while serving his country abroad. The family wants the body to come back and a proper burial to be given, not because your son will come back to life. He will not, but you get closure, and that satisfies the need for meaning. And once we got rid of God, like Nietzsche chronicled in the second half of the 19th century, we fluidly compensated towards closure. Because you see, even if nature is going to kill me anyway, by understanding nature, I get one up against nature. So yeah, you're going to kill me, but I figured you out. And that gives us meaning. So this delusion of having to believe that monkeys who have been, apes, who have been running around a rock for sporting an intellect for no more than 50,000 years, which is the blink of an eye ago, this delusion that those apes already have an evolved enough cognitive system to capture and corral into their conceptual understanding everything that is salient about reality and the nature of reality, is a preposterous idea. The notion that we figured it all out, it's a matter of crossing the T's and dotting the I's, it's an absolutely preposterous idea. So why people fall for this? Well, because they need meaning. They lost God, they lost transcendence, so they need now to find meaning somewhere else, and that's closure. We figured nature out. We're going to die anyway. Too bad, but at least we figured it out, and we got one up on nature. It will kill us, but we figured it. You see, that's the psychological mechanism behind this, that most scholars, scientists, philosophers have no clue about, that this is what's happening. Why? Because most Western scholars are like children when it comes to introspection. And I put myself in that category. Maybe I'm a teenager. I'm a little bit better than the average. But we are children. We have no introspective insight into the psychological dispositions and the psychological forces that cause us to think what we think, that cause us to believe what we believe and say what we say. We have absolutely no insight into those inner mechanisms, and therefore we cannot question them. We cannot look behind them critically and figure out whether it's an objective thing, good reasons to believe this, or whether we are just, in the hands of an emotion-driven psychological mechanism. If we are not aware that this is happening, we cannot look critically, and therefore we are in the hands of those psychological mechanisms. And I submit to you that in Western scholarship, this is what affects the majority. They have no introspective insight into what is actually moving them to believe what they believe. They convince themselves that they're being entirely objective, while in fact, it's the opposite that's going on.
I can't believe my ears when I hear you speak, because uh, the amount of what you've just said I found coming out of my own mouth on a regular basis, it really is astonishing. I was just doing an exegesis on the Bhagavad Gita just last week, and the metaphor I was using was, camera one or panta camera two. Camera one is the fact, our evolutionary physiology. The camera one is the fact that we're hominids, we're primates, and we have a certain physiology and even sociology that is taken as necessary and absolutely real for our survival. And the body wants nothing more to do than to survive. It's been life has been doing this millions of years, and our genome is at most, to the best of our knowledge, 100 to 2,000 to 200,000 years old. And this is real. This is important. What Krishna is saying in the Bhagavad Gita to Arjuna is Pantakamra 2. There's more to you than worm food. There's more to you than meets the eye. There's more to you than primate physiology. There's more to you than ape sociology. There's more to you. And Krishna is wise. He first tries the whole, they're going to shame you. They're going to shame you. Are you a man or are you a mouse? Are you a eunuch? He tries that and it doesn't work to get Arjuna to fight. And then he says, like, you want to take a begging bowl? You speak the words of the wise, but you are not wise, because the wise do not grieve for the living or the dead. So then he pants the camera too, and there's this idea. The other very large idea that you've said that's been an instinct of mine. First of all, not only is there a means of introspection, there's not even a trusting of those who have the fruits of introspection. So in scholarship, 60% of my process is shut off, so I can do proper scholarship. When I'm teaching in wisdom settings, that part is the part they want. And strangely enough, my students are all very well educated. They're doctors and lawyers and accountants and teachers and this and that. And as you said earlier, they're looking for the permission not to be unscientific, but to be trans-scientific where needed to deal with the questions of being. And I've said this many, many times. The vast majority of scholars don't realize this. And I had this insight long before I've done over 350 podcasts interviewing authors on their works. The vast majority of authors do not understand their motivations for writing the books they write. Yes, there's intellectual curiosity, of course, brilliant intellectual research, of course, but they do not understand that in the language of ancient Indic thought, it's either raga or dvesha. They're attached to something or they're adverse to something. And this attachment or this aversion to something cultural or historical or whatever, this is what's driving their work. And ironically, if they understood this, and if they're more vocal about this, and if they're able to articulate this, more people would care about the research, because they would understand why they themselves care about the research, right?
But you can't even say that to them, because this will just make the ego defense mechanisms very prickly, and it will be immediately rejected, because the ego needs to defend itself, right? The truths we are talking about here, and which Aldous Huxley called the perennial philosophy, so we don't getting to the question of, is it Western, is it Eastern, is it Southern? It's the perennial philosophy. It's the immanent truth behind most of the world's philosophical and religious narratives. Um, it is scary. If you truly understand what the perennial philosophy is, it can be scary. Most people in the West think of the perennial philosophy and the notion that nature is one great mind and that death is a change in a state of consciousness from a dissociative one, from a or at least a less dissociated one. People in the West tend to regard these things as romantic and reassuring. But if that's what you think it is, and you think it is only that, then you haven't really appreciated the implications of this. They have not become acquainted with what I call the vertigo of eternity, which is something that you recoil from immediately. The first time you dip your toe in those waters, you run away until you're 10 miles away, and you swear to God you're never going to move in that direction again. It is scary stuff. And the way we protect ourselves subconsciously, we don't know that we are doing this, but the way we protect ourselves against it is twofold. One is the anthropological approach. We will take this mythology and we are not going to weigh whether it has value or not, whether it's true or not. We'll just say, this is a mythology produced by a certain people at a certain point in time. We'll write a monograph about it, and that's cultural history, and you're perfectly insulated from it. We just put a wall between us and it.
We've
That's one
controlled it.
form. Yeah, yeah, yeah. We parked it. We put it in a drawer. It's an anthropological study of cultural history now. Now, if you look at the departments of philosophy of religion in a lot of Western universities, you will find that the head of that department is an outspoken atheist. Outspoken atheists are now chosen, by and large, as the heads of the philosophy of religion departments, which is like, it's like hiring a fox to watch over the hens.
Or the tone deaf music historian for the
Yeah.
musicology department.
Yeah, yeah. But this is all part of this sort of subconscious, at least non-deliberate self-defense mechanism that we adopt, because deep inside we know that if you survive death, that's a very scary thing. It's again the great unknown. You will be there, not in this form anymore. In what form? You don't know. What you're going to experience, you don't know. It's mighty scary if you really absorb that. And the vertigo of eternity. We are always defending ourselves against it while trying to protect some other alternative source of meaning that is safe, such as closure, such as seeing yourself as an individual as better than the masses, because you're now an elite scholar. So you get another source of meaning by seeing yourself as superior, or you get more meaning when you think you contributed to the great project of science, which will survive you. So you will, in a sense, survive in the form of the great limitless project of science. As long as we protect these alternative sources of meaning that are well behaved and well compartmentalized because we lost transcendent meaning, and we protect the ego, and we erect this wall against the true implications of understanding the perennial philosophy and embodying it, we are comfortable. And that makes us what Nietzsche called over 100 years ago, 150 now, he called the last man, or the last humans, as opposed to the superman or the superhuman, the Übermensch. And the last man would not entertain the big questions. All they would do is distract themselves, stupefy themselves, sedate themselves through eating meat and watching reality television, and playing the games of social media. That's exactly what we are doing. Nietzsche didn't use these words because it was too long in the past. But if you look at his description of the last man, that's us. So we find a precarious form of safety and comfort by turning our lives into the ultimate banality and superficiality, because we are afraid of what we'll find if we look deeper under the surface and examine life. We intuit deep within that that's dangerous territory, which sure enough it is. I mean, it is also the road to enlightenment and wisdom, but it is dangerous territory. We do it that. And therefore, we stupefy ourselves with banality, with what you find in the media now, with the denial of even the very concept of truth, which we are now denying. We are in very dark ages and have been for a while now. Hopefully, we'll begin ascending from this at some point.
Yeah, I mean, and Nietzsche obviously was extraordinarily insightful, and yet much of what he said maps on to yoga philosophy. And the Yoga Sutra is talking about the states of awareness and this idea of someone being mudha, they're stupefied. And the sutras are wise to say, don't bother trying to teach such a one. Not that we're better than them. They're
No,
not
it's
in a
hopeless.
space. They're not in a space. They're not.
Yeah.
You're wasting. You're teaching calculus to a sparrow. It's okay. Sparrow has its dharma. It's fine. This idea of I love this idea of the vertigo of eternity, and but yet I you see it's so interesting because I don't talk about the eternal or the profound or any of this in scholarly circles, and so but typically when I'm teaching in spiritual circles, we use the idea or the playful language of Harry Potter. They call the Muggles, we refer to it as the Muggles. If you're speaking with a Muggle, then you need a certain lens because their worldview is different, and it's not a question of showing that you're wiser or smarter. It's a question of not doing harm to someone who's not ready to understand things in a certain way or not ready to have the to meet the Wizard of Oz type thing. And it's interesting. So it's understandable that to a Muggle, yes, there's the vertigo of eternity, and yet to the vast majority of people that I teach and study with in spiritual circles, it's the inebriation, it's the allure of the eternal for the seekers, right? For those who are seeking, for the few who are seeking it, yes, of course, it's trepidation as with anything exciting and new, and yet for those who are seeking it, it's inebriation, it's allure, it's something where there's no question that there's more to reality than meets the eye. There's no question that there's more to me than my physical and social bullshit. How do I understand it? How do I access it? What layers of self do I need to peel away? And I really like the idea of science for many being not only a source of truth in a quote unquote religious sense, but also a source of the afterlife. I can live on by contributing to the history of ideas, which is utterly fascinating. Now, you say that you feel that we're in dark times, and I don't think that I disagree. Perhaps I would nuance it in some way. Um, in a sense, it's sort of bifurcated because the texture of the age is so. There are so many people who are so very manipulated by media and social media and materialism and our cultural trappings, and yet there's so many people who are seeking meaning. And I'm sure that for example, I'm sure you have a fairly large audience of people who are open to ideas and growing. And do you feel that maybe we are turning things around, at least in certain circles?
I don't know. What I do know is that this movement of the transpersonal within me that drives me and flat out forces me to do what I do. Um, it doesn't matter to it. There's something to be done, and whether I think it's helping or not, how I see it fitting with the rest, even if I see it fitting with the rest at all, it's unimportant. I have to do what I have to do. And I don't need to know the grand scheme of things to do what nature's trying to do through me, right? If people would just pay attention to the flow of the impersonal within them, then they would be put themselves at service to nature without needing to understand what nature is up to. So for me, that's what I do. I don't know. The only thing I have observed over the past 15 years is that the discussion has been legitimized, and before it was not. So that's hopeful. That's that that's a positive step forward. Um, but whether we are really progressing as a species, as a culture, there there are days I think we aren't there. There are days in which I'm in such a dark place that I think, well, what is what is the point of all this? And yet I have to do what I have to do. And look, if you ask Bernardo Kastrup who he is and what he wants, if you ignore the impersonal within me, the impersonal is in everybody, and it the important point in us. Bernardo Kastrup is the little ego that we wrongly identify with. If you ask him who he is and what he would like to do, well, who he is a child who likes to play with computers. And what he wants to do is keep on designing one computer a year. And that's it. He doesn't need to understand the big questions. He doesn't need to go down the path of facing the vertigo of eternity. He doesn't need anything. All he wants to do is play with computers. So when I am in that mode, I feel very alien in the world where we live. And the impulse I have is go back to Switzerland, where I used to live by myself. A nice wooden house up a mountain in an out of the way valley, and spend my days there building my computers and maybe taking care of some sheep, which I enjoy too. I like sheep. I think they're great animals. Um, why haven't I done that? Could I do that today? Yes, I could do that today. Um, why don't I do it? Well, it's the flow of the impersonal within me. I feel absolutely forced to do certain things. And when I don't do that, I can get even physically sick. At least psychologically, I go down the drain. I become dysfunctional if I don't do what clearly is trying to happen through me. But that's the only reason I am a player in this great dynamics. Otherwise, I probably would have withdrawn. So I'm speaking to you now as Bernardo Kastrup, not as the philosopher. The philosopher has no name, some strange creature. Um, Bernardo Kastrup never wrote a word of philosophy. Well, maybe he chose some words, but he never came up with anything. I never wrote a book that I wanted to write. Writing every book has been a pain. Finishing every book is not a joy, but a relief. Um, and maybe particularly this week or the couple of weeks that have passed with what's happening in Ukraine and Palestine and what's happening in the U.S. The culture wars in the U.S. I can feel pretty negative about it, pretty negative. And sometimes I wonder, what am I doing here? What I did learn over the years, and to go back to your question, Raj, what I did learn over the years is that I have never turned anybody. I have never convinced anybody of something they hadn't already seen before. I've never changed anybody's minds. This has never happened. What happens is that people deep within already know it. And then when they come across something I wrote, then they find the words to explain to themselves what is it that they already knew. And so I think I have some clarity about the magnitude of what I'm doing, which is very small in the sense that I'm not changing anybody's minds. I don't think I changed a single person's mind ever. All I have done was to help people give words to what they already knew. So it's very modest. At the same time, it's the only way to go, perhaps. It's the only thing we can do. But when I am in a negative space and I am aware that this is what I have ever achieved, just help people give words to what they already knew, then I think it's such a minor thing for such a minor effect, for having to confront a world that feels so absolutely strange and alien to me. Why am I doing this? Why don't I go to the mountains, back to the mountains, and just disappear? My partner, my girlfriend, would certainly be willing to do that because she's a very introvert person, does art, which she could do anywhere else. And I have the means. Why don't I do that? So yeah, I'm not in a good place for the past months, maybe, with everything that's happening in the world.
Yeah, that's entirely understandable. And there's so much going on. Um, may I offer a perspective? on what you just said?
Absolutely.
Yeah, there's so much going on, and I find myself, because it's so, there's so much going on that's really very much intertwined with the zeitgeist and the genesis of Western civilization, on many levels, both in terms of biblical narrative, both in terms of the foundation of this entity called America, and and the Civil War that's been going on since. There's so much that is being transformed in Western consciousness. So for myself, my strategy is, my job is to be positive, remain positive, and pour positivity and creativity and insights as best I can, but to every human with whom I interact, whether it's a colleague, whether it's a student, whether it's this. This is my job, and my job is to help people stay positive, because so I advocate having, we consume, but just as we consume food, we have to be careful not to eat too much junk food and too much toxins, because we will be poisoned by it. And so it's a fine line between staying informed and being poisoned. There's a fine line. And so I often sort of counsel, less is more in terms of exposure to what's going on. And also, the times are dark, but in these very, very dark times, what do people need? Light. We're called to cultivate our light. We're called to share our light. We're called to band together as best we can, for those of us who want to intellectual or spiritual or emotional nourishment. Now, if I can offer just a perspective on sort of what happens in my mind stuff, if you will, when you speak, there is this idea, this very prevalent and powerful idea in Indic thought, powerful with respect to the human experience, that is loosely thought of as karmic theory. And the idea that an individual is here, and they've been here many times, and they've had many, perhaps, if we, for the sake of argument, we accept this theorization of the human experience, perhaps Bernardo was an acharya Vedanta in a previous life, and he understood some wisdom teachings. Perhaps he was a shaman in the Americas. Perhaps he was a Shakta, a Tantrika, etc., etc. And in this life, he is perhaps bringing wisdom with him, whether innately or from previously or from his own observation. But the idea is that there is a karma, there are forces. When you say what nature is trying to do through me, the idea is that prakriti, or material creation, insofar as human beings are concerned, we are propelled by the karmic patterns. We're very lucky to have a job. We're extremely lucky to have a career, and we're beyond blessed to have a mission, because a mission is a calling that we will heed n'importe quoi. It doesn't matter. Did I want to be an academic? No, actually. Do I enjoy it? Yeah, in large measure, I do. There is a certain fulfillment to it. Do I enjoy shedding off the vast majority of my insights to eke out arguments about books in a particular context? Not always. Raj very much enjoys creative writing. He probably would be a fantasy author or some such thing. Maybe there'll come a day when he'll scratch that itch. But there are some, according to this theory, karmic pressures that this person needs to exhaust in this life. And my sense is that Bernardo is not just on a path to scratch the itch for himself. There are certain souls that are on a path to affect the scaffolding of culture and society. And there are certain souls that we think of in the Western context as ahead of their times. But actually, to my mind, they're not ahead of their times. They're bringing the future into the present. They're affecting the change that
Or
needs
the
to be
past.
affected. Yes. And so I think much of what's being done is not about convincing individuals, although I think individuals may well have been convinced. Or if wisdom is innate and you're talking about something innate, their soul knows this, but their mind may never know this. And if their mind never catches up, they'll live a very different life. But I think a very important, difficult, and therefore extremely important accomplishment of what's being done through the conditioning of Bernardo is the validation and the institutionalization, or the establishment of these ideas in a manner consistent with the trajectory of Western thought and the history of science, and there's a reason why you have two PhDs, right? There's a reason why you confine your insights to a particular paradigm, because that's crucial and that's needed. And I think the reverberations of that are far greater than you can possibly anticipate at present. Um, Another piece that I would like to ask, perhaps, is to my knowledge, you're an academic, you're a scholar, the same way that I'm a scholar, but you're not an academic insofar as that you're not looking for an academic post at an institution. That's something that I've talked about a number of times on the podcast, because the entity known as Raj got his PhD in 2015, and while he has a number of teaching affiliations with universities, he's also opted to be independent for a variety of reasons, much of which has to do with the job market and religious studies, which is non-existent. Some of it has to do with the humanities going to hell in a handbasket, and some of it has to do with just feeling called to create a model for other bright, passionate people who get PhDs and are all dressed up with no place to go. So, could you say a bit about your trajectory and academia proper, and maybe some of your decisions?
Well, even my second PhD, I got it one because I looked back and I had a number of good papers published in respected peer-reviewed journals. So you are already 80% of the way. So why not just, formalize it and get a second PhD? And also because I was exposed to valid ad hominem attacks. I don't think ad hominem is fundamentally inappropriate. I think some ad hominems are appropriate given the context. And I was accused several times of, no, your doctorate is in computer engineering, computer science. So who are you to tell us about philosophy? And I thought that's a valid line of attack. The point is I don't have the authority to say what I'm saying. It's ad hominem, but I thought it holds water. So I I got myself the second PhD. But beyond these two reasons, I don't have any motivation I didn't have any motivation just to add another PhD after my name, Bernardo Kastrup, PhD, PhD. But I didn't do that for that reason. Um, I've been discussions with some people, I should get a third one. And I'm like, oh, if
No
it happens
need.
by itself, no need for that. Enough titles. Um, I don't like it when people call me doctor. It makes me feel like it makes me feel uncomfortable. It's a way to dehumanize me. That I mean, I'm not saying that people do it with that intent. It's how I experience it, and I know it's crazy, but this is how I experience me. If people refer to me Dr. Kastrup, it's like they're kicking me upstairs. They are dehumanizing me, creating distance between their humanity and me, as if I were not human. It's not their intent. They are trying to be respectful. But this is how I secretly, well, not secretly anymore. This is how I feel it. So I have been pushed by PR specialists to add the letters PhD to my name on my website because there are people there who wants to make me look like a crank, and you sort of insulate that by making use of your title. So it's a very pragmatic thing. But if you ask me, am I comfortable with that? Not quite. But I have a very clear, now that I'm turning 50, I have developed the ability to very, very clearly sense the movement of the impersonal within me, to sense that will that is not mine, but which is emerging through me. And it has telltale signs, like it doesn't care about your comfort and safety at all. Doesn't care whether you have food in front of you tomorrow and a roof over your head, or whether you're going to go out in the fields with the lions. It doesn't care. There is something that needs to be done, and it's not about you, has never been about you. And if you have to compromise your own personal safety for this, then so be it. And if you die, well, it finds somebody else to do the deed. You know what I mean? So this is one of the characteristics. There are a number of other characteristics, and I've paid enough attention that today the impersonal will moving within me, it's not even subtle anymore. It's very much on my face. It's not difficult to see. It's difficult to deal with it, but it's not difficult to sense it. And you called it karmic load. I have the tendency to personalize it and call it the daimon, like Socrates' daimon. It's like another entity within you, and you can feel its, you can think its thoughts, you can feel its feelings. But what it wants is not what you want for yourself. It's an impersonal will. It's like Schopenhauer's will of nature. So if what you call karmic load, I call daimon, I will use the word daimon now just because I'm used to it. I'm comfortable with it. I very clearly see the diamond. I mean, I don't see it as a body shape, but I introspect and, oh, I see it's moving, or I see it's not quiet today, or I know it's giving me a holiday now. Let me, make use of that for as long as I can, because I know I have to come back and pay my future dues in a while. I clearly see it. I see it when it's asleep. I see it when it's awake. I see it when it's in a hurry. I see it when its impetus is overwhelming. I know it can make me sick. I know it can make me depressed. I know it can make me physically ill. Um, and the first time I discerned it, and maybe that's part of the reasons why I personalize it, even though it's not a personal thing. I give it a name as if it were a personal thing. The reason was that the first time it came up in me, was very surprising and very overwhelming. I lost my father when I was 12 years old, and my father was my hero, my safe harbor, the ground I walked on. He was everything to me. So when I lost him, I lost everything, because nobody else in my family could even come closer to this, and everybody was trying to comfort me, which only made me feel worse. So I would pull away from people, and I remember in the weeks that followed my father's death, I used to go to bed much before I was really asleep, because I just wanted to be left alone. And so I would lie in bed for like 2 hours trying to visualize my life without my father, and drawing a blank every time and getting into that spiral of despair. And there was a night I started punching the wall next to my bed. Not because I was angry, but I was in a place I couldn't be and I couldn't get out of it. And then you start doing something. And as I was punching that wall in despair, the voice pops in my mind. And the voice says, the boy is really desperate now. And I was like, what? Where the hell did that come from? Because it was not like a ghost, it was my voice. And the thoughts behind the statement were my thoughts. I knew it was me, but at the same time, it was totally not me, because that thing was not desperate. That thing was not buried by the circumstances, by the
It
death
was
of
the
his father.
witnessing
Yeah,
self.
yeah, that thing was ageless, was not a kid, was not old, was not young. It was outside time. And that was the introduction of the diamond into my life. And it never left. Even during my teenage years, it was always there. And it always gives you a sense of direction. I never woke up a single day in my life thinking, what am I going to do now? I mean, maybe I didn't know exactly what to do, but I knew the direction. Always, every single second of my entire life, from 12 years old, when that happened for the first time, until now, I don't know the long-term game. I don't know what I'm going to be doing 5 years from now. I don't know whether I'm going to live that long. What I know is that every day, at every single moment, I know the direction. And it's not the direction I choose, it's chosen for me, often with complete disregard for my personal goals, my personal comfort, my personal preferences, my personal safety. Um, so maybe that's what you call karmic load. If it is, I know this by acquaintance, not out of theory, not out of conceptual machinations and reasoning. No, if this is what you call the karmic load, this has been the anchor and compass of my life since I was 12 years old. It's there. It's undeniable. I mean, if somebody tells me a story trying to contradict it, I would just smile and say, okay, but because it will not change anything about its presence. It's an overwhelming presence. And it's not a presence. I'm finishing now. Um, a lot of people who talk about the daimon in the Western tradition, they often talk about it as the siren song that seduces and pulls you forward. Mine is not that. Mine kicks me from behind, pushes me from behind, forces. It's uncaring. It doesn't care how I feel. There is something to be done, and deal with it. Know what I mean? You are something nature is doing, and this is what nature wants to do. What you want is irrelevant. It doesn't play any role. We don't give a damn. The only thing I can get from it occasionally is a brief holiday. Occasionally, I can get a holiday. So if that's what karmic load is, yeah, it's there and it's ruthless.
Fascinating. So that typically probably would be called in the language of most of Hinduism the Atman, the self, the abiding witness, the aspect of the self that is who and what we ultimately are, that it witnesses and looks on. There's this parable from the Upanishads that, sort of in the tree of life, there's two birds. There's one bird that eats, rejoices at the sweet fruit, recoils at the sour fruit, and there's a second bird that's just watching, undisturbed, unperturbed. And so the second bird is the parable that inside the individual, there's this aspect that is a source of direction, it's a source of conscience, it's a source of wisdom, and it's detached. It's not caught up in the liking and the disliking, and as you say, the preferences. It's detached and it knows what needs to be done. And yeah, please
It
go
is
ahead.
detached in the sense that it's not buried by circumstances. It always has a sort of high rising point of view from above, from the outside. But it's not detached in the sense that it is highly engaged with the world. Because if it were not, then nothing would be required of me. The fact that something clearly wants to happen through me means that whatever it is that the impetus behind it is engaged with the world. It cares about the grand scheme of things. So in that sense, it's not detached, at least in my experience, if you understand what I mean.
Yeah, I do. I do. I think it's very much similar to this idea we see in the Bhagavad Gita of Nishkam Karma Yoga, where it'll act. So one way to think of this is that through the lens of karmic theory, the individual, because of karmic antecedents and desires and a variety of factors, comes in with a mandate, with a purpose. Some people have a lot of firm or drudha karma. Some people have a lot of infirm karma, so they have much more free will and much more wiggle room. Everyone has some infirm and some firm. Some souls, perhaps like the people on this call, are just here for the ride. There's stuff that they need to do, and it's going to happen. And
That's my life.
so in the language of Indic thought, it's riddha. It's very firm karma because of the antecedents, partially because of the strength of the antecedents of what's being done before. And the jivatman, that higher self, is on a mission to accomplish that. So yes, on some level, yes, once you die, it can take up someone else. Yes, perhaps there's truth there. But on another level, this has to be accomplished by this conditioning, because this conditioning will not emerge in nature ever again in this combination and at this juncture of history. And because of the rarefication of both of these things and the ways in which they're working in tandem, because that individual soul is not on a personal mission but on a social mission, it must ripen now. Or so says the theory. Who knows if any of this is true?
No, it resonates with me at a symbolic level, which is the only level that has depth. It does resonate with me. The reason I personalize it and separate it from me, um, you probably know I have been reading Jung since I was 14 years old. So Jung has been a big influence for me. And at some point in his corpus, Jung talks about this notion of uh, separating the daimon, personalizing it, giving it a name, and externalizing it from you, you meaning your ego, not your psyche, because of course the diamond is part of your psyche, but separating it from your ego self. And Jung says doing this is important so you have a moral ground. And this may come across as strange, but Jung's point is the following: because the will of the diamond so often undermines yourself. If you don't externalize it, so you can have a dialogue with it, you can't bargain with it, but maybe you can negotiate with it. If you don't do that, then morally, it's an incredibly heavy load to tell yourself, what I'm about to do is going to screw up my entire life as I planned it so far. And it's me doing that. The moral load of this inner contradiction, according to Jung, can be too heavy if you're not mature enough, if you're a fragile ego. And that's how I felt. I certainly was not mature enough at 12 years old, man. My world had just imploded. And I didn't have the maturity. I didn't know about Jung yet at that point. But by the time I was 18, I knew it. And it has been my modus operandi, my defense mechanism against the overwhelming presence of the diamond, or my karmic load, to exteriorize it, to give it a name and treat it as an entity, such that when it makes choices that undermine me, I can tell myself, well, those choices are not made by me. You see, they are being imposed on me. Morally, I can stand that ground. But I couldn't stand it if I would look in the mirror and say, I'm completely undermining everything I've ever wanted. I couldn't. Maybe today, as I turn 50, maybe I could do that. But now I'm so used to relating with it as a separate entity with which I can dialogue, even though I think its thoughts, I feel its feelings. And now it's not like it's a ghost or an apparition. No. I feel its thoughts. I feel its feelings. And yet I exteriorize it, because this has been my strategy for so long that to try to change it at this point is, these are the terms under which I relate to it. And I have survived so far. Hopefully I will continue to survive.
Well, certainly it's a personal journey, and it's a strategy that has served you well, clearly, since this terrible loss at 12 years old, and clearly something, the lotus emerges from the mud. From this terrible loss, you've gained this perspective of, for lack of a better terminology, the higher self, perhaps the ego and the higher self, the Atman, the soul, the higher self, the wisdom body, however you want to think of it and however you want to personalize it. And without question, it's useful to understand the various personages, the various characters in the car, and various ones will grab the wheel at different times. It's very useful to understand that we're not homogenous beings, that we're complex and multivalent.
We're a busload of people in the same
busload, exactly. And then I think that for some, depending on their trajectory, the distinction between the ego and the higher self is there, but depending on their trajectory, the locus of awareness will more often than not be in the higher self, upon which they look at the ego and say, oh, look at what ego wants now, look at what Bernardo wants now. So I think it's just a question of perspective, but certainly this negotiation is serving you, so I suggest you continue it. We've had a really fascinating and far-reaching conversation. Was there anything else about the book or about the work or anything at all that you wanted to add for today?
No, I think it would be artificial at this point to try to insert that back in. No, okay. We had a great conversation.
Great. Thank you very much for appearing on the podcast.
I very much appreciate your feedback and the opportunity, Raj.
For those listening, we have been speaking with Dr. Bernardo Kastrup. The link for his website and all of his fascinating work is in the podcast notes, as well as the link for his exciting upcoming book that we just dove into. Until next time, keep listening, keep reading, and keep contemplating what is real versus not real. Take care.